The wind, a timeless sculptor, howls across the rugged peaks of the Zagros Mountains, in what is now Iraqi Kurdistan. It whispers secrets through the desolate valleys, secrets held for tens of thousands of years. Imagine for a moment standing before a vast, shadowed opening in a limestone cliff face, the entrance to Shanidar Cave. Dust motes dance in the slivers of sunlight that dare to penetrate the gloom, illuminating ancient rockfalls and the faint, mineral scent of ages. It was here in the mid-20th century that a team of archaeologists began to peel back the layers of time, uncovering remains that would challenge our understanding of ancient human life and death. But among the discoveries of hearths and tools, something more unsettling began to emerge, a whisper of violence from an almost unimaginable past. What dark secret did this mountain sanctuary hold, hinting at a prehistoric drama of life and brutal premature death? If deep history fascinates you, consider subscribing for more. The cave itself, Shanidar, is not merely a hole in the rock. It's a profound archive of human prehistory. Its yawning mouth, some 25 meters wide and 8 meters high, opens into a vast chamber that stretches nearly 40 meters deep into the mountainside. For millennia, it offered shelter from the harsh elements and a vantage point over the surrounding landscape. The initial excavations, led by the American archaeologist Ralph Selecki, began in 1951. His team, working in challenging conditions, meticulously uncovered layers of sediment that chronicled intermittent occupation spanning an astonishing 100,000 years. They found evidence of both Neanderthals and later, early modern humans using this very space. This immediately placed Shanidar Cave on the map as a site of global significance, a place where the story of our ancient cousins, the Neanderthals, could be read in the earth itself. But it wasn't just the sheer antiquity or the presence of multiple hominin species that made Shanidar famous. It was the nature of the Neanderthal remains. Several individuals were unearthed, some seemingly buried with care, leading to early theories of Neanderthal compassion and ritual. However, even in these initial stages, subtle signs hinted that not all was peaceful in this prehistoric abode. Fragmented bones and unusual marks began to suggest a more complex and perhaps more violent narrative than simple natural death. Local Kurdish guides and workers whose knowledge of the terrain was indispensable to Solecki's expeditions sometimes spoke of the cave in hushed tones, occasionally associating such imposing natural features with jinns or spirits, a reminder of the deep human instinct to imbue mysterious places with powerful forces. Scholars still debate whether the initial, somewhat romanticized portrayal of Shanidar as a purely peaceful Neanderthal cemetery fully captured the nuanced, and potentially harsher, realities preserved within its sediments, particularly as more sophisticated analytical techniques became available. The cave had begun to yield its secrets, but the grimmest was yet to be fully understood, a story of an individual fate that would spark decades of scientific inquiry and debate. Among the 10 Neanderthal individuals eventually identified within Shanidar Cave, one in particular became the focal point of a chilling prehistoric mystery. This was Shanidar III, an adult male Neanderthal, estimated to have been between 40 and 50 years old at the time of his death, a considerable age for the harsh realities of the Paleolithic period. His remains were discovered by Ralph Solecki's team in 1957, lying in Layer D of the cave's stratigraphy, a layer dated to a crucial juncture in prehistory. This individual was not just any ancient hominin, he was a Neanderthal, Homo neanderthalensis, our closest extinct human relative, a species that thrived across Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years before vanishing from the fossil record. Shanidar III lived and died at a time when the Neanderthal world was on the cusp of profound change, a period that saw the increasing presence of anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, expanding out of Africa and into territories long held by Neanderthals. The skeleton of Shanidar III, though incomplete, provided a wealth of information. He was robustly built, characteristic of Neanderthals with strong bones and a large cranial capacity. His remains were found among a scatter of other bones and stone tools, typical of a Neanderthal occupation layer. There was no immediate, obvious sign of a formal burial, unlike some other Shanidar individuals, such as Shanidar IV, the famous flower burial, whose interpretation has itself been a subject of ongoing discussion. The initial examination of Shanidar III focused on general aspects of his health and age, but a particular injury soon caught the attention of researchers, an injury that seemed out of place, sinister even. One quirky detail sometimes overlooked in the broader discussion of Neanderthal physicality is the sheer strength indicated by their skeletal robusticity. Some researchers have drawn comparisons to modern-day rodeo athletes in terms of muscle mass and the ability to withstand significant physical stress, perhaps a necessary adaptation for their close-quarters hunting of large game. The critical period in which Shanidar III lived, broadly between 40,000 and 50,000 years ago, makes his story particularly compelling. This was a time of significant climatic fluctuations, altering landscapes and potentially putting pressure on resources. More importantly, it was a window during which Neanderthals and early modern humans likely encountered each other in regions like the Near East, including the Zagros Mountains. The nature of these encounters, whether they were peaceful, competitive, or involved interbreeding, is one of the most hotly debated topics in paleoanthropology. Shanidar III, therefore, represents not just an individual, but a data point in this larger, unfolding human drama. Scholars still debate whether the broader Neanderthal population was already in decline due to environmental factors, or if the arrival of Homo sapiens played a more direct role in their eventual disappearance. The discovery of Shanidar III, with his specific injuries, would add a far more personal and violent dimension to these abstract population-level questions, forcing us to consider the stark reality of individual conflict in the deep past. Shanidar Cave was not merely a final resting place for a few unfortunate individuals. It was a repeatedly occupied home, a significant locus of Neanderthal life over many millennia. Understanding the broader context of this cave as a communal space is crucial to interpreting the story of Shanidar III. The sheer depth of the archaeological deposits, meticulously excavated by Solecki and later teams, reveals a long history of habitation. Hearths, animal bones bearing cut marks from stone tools, and a profusion of Mousterian stone implements, the characteristic toolkit of the Neanderthals, paint a picture of a dynamic, living environment. This was a place where Neanderthals sheltered from the harsh Zagros winters, processed hunted game, crafted their tools, and evidently sometimes buried their dead. The discovery of multiple Neanderthal individuals, ranging from infants to older adults like Shanidar III, suggests that the cave held a persistent significance for local Neanderthal groups, perhaps being revisited seasonally or across generations. The most famous of these burials, Shanidar IV, unearthed in 1960, generated considerable debate due to the presence of pollen clumps found in the surrounding soil. Ralph Solecki, along with palynologist Arlette Leroy-Gourhan, proposed that these pollens indicated that the individual had been buried with flowers, suggesting a complex, symbolic, and perhaps even ritualistic behavior among Neanderthals. This flower burial hypothesis, widely popularized, contributed to a significant shift in the perception of Neanderthals, moving them away from the brutish caveman stereotype towards a more humanized image. However, scholars still debate whether the pollen was introduced by human action or by natural agents, such as burrowing rodents like the yurd, which are known to bring flowers into their burrows. This ongoing discussion highlights the complexities of interpreting ancient sites and the importance of considering multiple lines of evidence. The presence of other individuals with notable injuries also adds to the cave's narrative. Shanidar I, for instance, was an older male who had suffered multiple debilitating injuries during his life, including a crushed eye socket, a withered arm, likely amputated or non-functional from a young age, and severe arthritis. Yet he lived to a relatively old age, suggesting that he was cared for by his group. This evidence of compassion and social support contrasts starkly with the potential violence indicated by Shanidar III's injuries, showcasing the multifaceted nature of Neanderthal social life. It implies that within these ancient communities, there was capacity for both nurturing care and perhaps lethal conflict. A lesser-known tidbit is that some of the animal bones found in Shanidar Cave include those of tortoises, which were likely roasted in their shells. A small but evocative detail of Neanderthal diet and culinary practices. The fact that the cave served as a recurring home and burial ground over such a vast time span underscores its importance in the Neanderthal world, making the violent demise of one of its inhabitants, Shanidar III, all the more poignant and puzzling. It wasn't just a random death in a random location. It was a potential tragedy within a community sanctuary. The skeletal remains of Shanidar III, upon closer inspection, revealed a crucial piece of evidence that set him apart from some of the other individuals in the cave. A distinct and deeply unsettling injury to his ribcage. Specifically, a lesion was identified on the upper surface of his left ninth rib. This was not a healed fracture, nor did it appear to be the result of post-mortem damage or natural taphonomic processes like rockfall or trampling. Instead, the characteristics of the wound strongly suggested a penetrating trauma, an injury inflicted by an external object piercing the chest. This telltale trauma became the central clue in what increasingly looked like a prehistoric cold case, prompting decades of analysis and reanalysis by various specialists in human osteology and forensic anthropology. The initial assessments by T. Dale Stewart, a physical anthropologist working with Selecki's team, noted the unusual nature of the rib lesion. Stewart observed that the wound was a clean cut, suggesting an object had entered the chest cavity with considerable force. The angle of the cut was also significant, indicating a downward and inward trajectory. Further examinations over the years employing more advanced imaging techniques have refined these initial observations. The wound channel is relatively narrow, and there is evidence of some healing around the margins, though not complete. This crucial detail, partial healing, indicates that Shanidar III did not die instantaneously from this injury. He survived for at least a few weeks, perhaps even longer, with the object, or a fragment of it, potentially still lodged in his chest, or having been removed. This period of survival would have been agonizing, likely leading to infection, difficulty breathing, and immense pain. Scholars still debate whether the wound itself was the ultimate cause of death, or if it contributed to a decline in health that eventually proved fatal, perhaps through sepsis or a punctured lung leading to pneumothorax. The fact that Shanidar III lived with such a grievous injury for any length of time again speaks to the resilience of Neanderthals, and perhaps to the care provided by his group, echoing the story of Shanidar I. However, the focus here remains on the origin of the trauma itself. One quirky and rather macabre detail that emerged from later analyses using scanning electron microscopy was the presence of microscopic striations within the cut mark, which could potentially be matched to the material of a weapon, though such a direct link has proven elusive. The injury's placement is also critical. The ninth rib is located in the lower left chest, an area protecting vital organs like the spleen, stomach, and the lower part of the left lung. A projectile penetrating this area would have a high likelihood of causing serious, life-threatening internal damage. This single mark on a single rib bone, carefully examined and re-examined, transformed Shanidar III from just another Neanderthal skeleton into a potential victim of a violent assault, opening a window onto the darker aspects of life in the Paleolithic. Pinpointing the time frame of Shanidar III's demise is crucial for understanding the context of this ancient tragedy. The archaeological layers in Shanidar Cave were dated using a combination of radiocarbon dating, of associated organic materials, and typological analysis of the stone tools found within them. Layer D, where Shanidar III's remains were unearthed, has yielded dates that place his existence, and therefore his death, broadly between 40,000 and 50,000 years ago during the Middle Paleolithic period. Some more recent analyses suggest a date closer to 45,000 years ago for the specific levels associated with him. This is not just an abstract number, it anchors the event firmly within a period of immense significance for human evolution and dispersal. The world of 45,000 years ago was a very different place. It was a time deep within the last ice age, characterized by fluctuating climates, with periods of intense cold interspersed with slightly warmer interstadials. The Zagros Mountains, where Shanidar Cave is located, would have experienced significant environmental shifts, impacting the availability of game, plant resources, and habitable zones. Neanderthals, well adapted to colder climates, had thrived in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. But by this period, they were facing new challenges. Critically, this time frame corresponds with the early waves of anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, migrating out of Africa and spreading across Eurasia. The Near East, including regions like the Zagros, is considered a key area where these two hominin populations would have likely first encountered each other in significant numbers. This raises the tantalizing and troubling possibility that the injury to Shanidar III might be linked to these intergroup dynamics. The implications of this dating are profound. If the perpetrator was indeed another human, the event speaks to the ancient roots of interpersonal and potentially intergroup violence. It forces us to confront the idea that conflict, even lethal conflict, was part of the human experience long before the rise of settled societies, agriculture, or complex political structures. Scholars still debate whether the pressures of climate change and resource scarcity during this period might have exacerbated tensions between different Neanderthal groups, or between Neanderthals and incoming Homo sapiens. Understanding the precise environmental conditions around Shanidar Cave at the time of Shanidar III's injury could offer clues about such pressures. One interesting, though not directly related to the violence, tidbit from this era is the evidence for Neanderthals exploiting marine resources in some coastal areas, showcasing their adaptability, which sometimes gets overlooked. The dating of Shanidar III to this specific window transforms his story from a personal tragedy into a potential snapshot of a critical turning point in human prehistory, a moment of encounter, competition, and perhaps violent interaction at the dawn of our own species' global expansion. The rib wound is not just a mark on a bone, it's a silent testament from a world on the brink of transformation. The nature of the wound on Shanidar III's ninth rib, its depth, angle, and relatively narrow channel, strongly suggests it was inflicted by a projectile weapon rather than a handheld stabbing implement or an accident. The force required to penetrate the rib and enter the chest cavity points to a thrown spear or dart. During the Middle Paleolithic, the technology for creating such weapons was certainly present. Neanderthals were skilled hunters, proficient in crafting stone-tipped wooden spears, primarily used for thrusting at close quarters during hunts of large game like wild cattle, deer, and goats, evidence of which abounds in sites like Shanidar Cave itself. However, the injury to Shanidar III seems more consistent with a lighter, faster-moving projectile, perhaps launched from a distance. This has led to considerable speculation about the type of weapon involved. While Neanderthals are best known for their robust thrusting spears, there is some evidence, albeit debated, for their use of more lightly constructed throwing spears. Anatomical studies of Neanderthal shoulder and arm morphology suggest they were certainly capable of powerful throwing motions. The critical element here is the tip. A sharpened wooden spear could potentially cause such an injury, but a stone-tipped projectile would be even more effective at piercing hide, muscle, and bone. The Mousterian toolkit characteristic of Neanderthals includes a variety of stone points, some of which could have been hafted onto spear shafts. The Levallois technique, a sophisticated method of stone knapping mastered by Neanderthals, allowed for the production of standardized flakes and points that were sharp and durable. Ralph Solecki himself, in his initial reports, considered the possibility of a wooden spear, given the lack of any embedded stone fragment in the wound. However, another possibility looms large, especially given the time frame: weapons technology associated with early modern humans. Homo sapiens. Migrating into Eurasia at this time are often credited with developing or refining projectile technologies, including lighter throwing spears, possibly even spear throwers, atlatels, which significantly increase the range and velocity of a launched dart. An atlatel dart, often tipped with a finely crafted stone point, could easily inflict the kind of deep, penetrating wound seen on Shanidar III. Scholars still debate the exact timeline for the widespread adoption of the spear thrower, with some arguing it became common slightly later. But the fundamental technology of effective throwing spears was certainly part of the Homo sapiens toolkit. One quirky experimental archaeology tidbit involves researchers creating replicas of Paleolithic spears and testing their penetration power on animal carcasses, providing valuable data on how different types of points and delivery mechanisms create distinct wound patterns. The forensic analysis of Shanidar III's rib, therefore, isn't just about identifying a weapon. It's about potentially identifying a technological signature, which could, in turn, point towards the identity of the assailant. The projectile, unseen and unrecovered, remains a ghost in this ancient drama, but its effects are clearly etched in bone. The question of who wielded the weapon that struck Shanidar III is perhaps the most compelling and contentious aspect of this prehistoric case. With the evidence pointing towards a deliberately inflicted projectile wound, two primary suspects emerge from the mists of time. Another Neanderthal or an early modern human, a Homo sapiens. The time frame, as we've established, around 45,000 years ago, places the event squarely within the period when these two human species likely coexisted and potentially competed in the Near East. The implications of either scenario are significant for our understanding of ancient human behavior and intergroup dynamics. If the perpetrator was another Neanderthal, it would provide stark evidence of intraspecies violence. While the image of Neanderthals has been rehabilitated from the brutish caveman stereotype, and evidence like that from Shanidar one suggests they were capable of compassion and care, it would be naive to assume they lived in a perpetual state of peace. Competition for resources, mates, or territory, or even personal disputes could certainly have escalated to violence, just as it does in modern human societies and among other primate groups. Evidence for healed trauma on other Neanderthal skeletons from various sites across Eurasia, while often ambiguous as to its cause, accidental versus intentional, suggests a physically demanding and sometimes dangerous existence. The challenge here is that if it were Neanderthal on Neanderthal violence, the weapon used would likely have been of Neanderthal manufacture. A Mysterian point on a spear, for instance. Differentiating this from a weapon used by an early Homo sapiens, based solely on the wound characteristics, is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, without the weapon itself. The alternative, and for many the more dramatic, possibility is that Shanidar III was a victim of an encounter with anatomically modern humans. As Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa, they would have inevitably come into contact with established Neanderthal populations. The nature of these interactions is a subject of intense research and debate. We know from genetic evidence that interbreeding occurred, leaving traces of Neanderthal DNA in modern non-African human populations. But interbreeding does not preclude conflict. Competition for prime hunting grounds, cave shelters like Shanidar, or other critical resources could easily have led to aggressive encounters. If Homo sapiens possessed more advanced projectile technology, such as the spear thrower we discussed earlier, it might have given them an advantage in any such confrontations. Scholars still debate whether the arrival of Homo sapiens directly contributed to the Neanderthals' decline and eventual extinction, or if other factors like climate change played a more significant role. The Shanidar III case, if interpreted as interspecies violence, would be a poignant piece of evidence supporting a more confrontational model. A curious and somewhat speculative fringe idea sometimes arises in popular discussions. Could differences in communication or social structure have led to fatal misunderstandings between the two groups? Without a time machine, the identity of the unseen perpetrator remains elusive, a shadow figure in a 45,000-year-old drama, leaving us to weigh the probabilities based on the limited, yet provocative evidence. Understanding the potential motives behind such a violent attack in the deep past requires us to step into a world vastly different from our own, yet governed by some of the same fundamental pressures. If Shanidar III was indeed murdered, what could have driven his assailant? In the absence of written records or direct witnesses, we must infer motives from the broader context of Paleolithic life, human behavior, and the ecological pressures of the time. Competition for resources is a primary candidate. 45,000 years ago, life was a constant struggle for survival. Access to prime hunting grounds, reliable water sources, and secure shelters like Shanidar Cave itself would have been critical. Any perceived threat to these resources, whether from a neighboring Neanderthal group or newly arrived Homo sapiens, could have escalated into conflict. Territoriality is closely linked to resource competition. While the concept of fixed, sharply defined territories as we understand them today might not perfectly apply to mobile hunter-gatherer groups, Paleolithic peoples likely had familiar ranges and areas they considered their own. Encroachment into such a range could have been met with suspicion and, potentially, aggression. The Zagros Mountains, with their mosaic of valleys and uplands, might have supported multiple small groups, leading to inevitable encounters and the potential for friction. Personal disputes, while impossible to reconstruct, cannot be ruled out either. Just as in any human society, rivalries, grievances, or struggles for dominance within or between groups could have led to violent outcomes. Perhaps Shanidar III was involved in a dispute over a kill, a tool, or a social position. Scholars still debate the prevalence and intensity of warfare or organized conflict in the Paleolithic. Some argue that prior to agriculture and settled societies, populations were too sparse and mobile for sustained warfare, with violence being more sporadic and personal. Others contend that the capacity for group aggression is deeply rooted in human evolutionary history. The injury to Shanidar III, if intentional, doesn't necessarily imply large-scale warfare, but it certainly points to lethal interpersonal violence. A quirky and often overlooked aspect of Neanderthal life that might have influenced social dynamics is their likely small group size. Estimates based on archaeological site extent and resource availability suggest typical Neanderthal bands may have numbered only a dozen to a few dozen individuals. In such small-scale societies, every adult member would have been crucial, making a violent death not just a personal tragedy, but a significant loss to the group's viability. The motive behind the attack on Shanidar III, whether it was a desperate fight for survival, a defense of territory, a tragic misunderstanding between different human groups, or something more personal, remains shrouded. Yet, exploring these possibilities helps us appreciate the complex social and ecological landscape in which our ancient relatives lived, a world where survival often depended on a delicate balance of cooperation and, at times, conflict. While the Shanidar III case is particularly compelling due to the clarity of the projectile wound and the rich context of the cave, it does not stand entirely alone as evidence of interpersonal violence in the deep past. Examining wider patterns of trauma in Paleolithic remains, both Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens, helps to contextualize this specific incident and understand if it was an anomaly or part of a broader, albeit perhaps infrequent, reality of ancient life. Across Eurasia, other skeletal remains from roughly contemporary periods bear marks that have been interpreted as evidence of violence, though often with more ambiguity than the Shanidar III rib lesion. For instance, the Neanderthal remains from Saint-Césaire in France, dating to around 36,000 years ago, include a skull with a healed fracture on the forehead. While this injury could have been accidental, some researchers have argued its characteristics are consistent with a blow from a blunt object. Similarly, at Cima de los Huesos, Pit of Bones, in Atapuerca, Spain, a much older site dating back over 400,000 years, remains of Homo heidelbergensis, an ancestor of Neanderthals, show evidence of interpersonal violence, including a skull with 2 distinct puncture wounds, interpreted by some as fatal blows. While significantly older than Shanidar III, these findings suggest that the capacity for lethal conflict predates even the Neanderthals. Closer to Shanidar III's time, remains of early Homo sapiens also show signs of trauma. The Jebel Sahaba cemetery in Sudan, dated to around 13,000 to 14,000 years ago, though much later than Shanidar III, it's one of the earliest clear examples of group conflict, contains numerous individuals with embedded stone projectiles and cut marks indicative of systematic violence. Scholars still debate the interpretation of many of these ancient injuries, as differentiating between accidental trauma, falls, hunting accidents, and intentional violence can be extremely challenging, especially with fragmented or poorly preserved remains. Taphonomic processes, the natural events that affect remains after death, can also mimic or obscure signs of trauma. However, the accumulation of cases like Shanidar III, where the evidence for intentional injury is strong, suggests that violence was a recurring, if not pervasive, feature of Paleolithic existence. One quirky and sometimes controversial area of study involves comparing trauma patterns in ancient hominins to those seen in modern hunter-gatherer groups or even non-human primates, looking for analogous behaviors or injury types. While such comparisons must be made cautiously, they can offer potential frameworks for interpreting ancient evidence. The overall picture emerging is not one of relentless Hobbesian war of all against all, but rather a complex tapestry where cooperation and care evidenced by individuals like Shanidar once surviving debilitating injuries, coexisted with episodes of lethal conflict. Shanidar 3's story, therefore, gains resonance when viewed against this wider backdrop of ancient lives marked by both resilience and the ever-present risk of violence. Interpreting ancient wounds like the one found on Shanidar 3's rib is a meticulous and challenging scientific endeavor, fraught with potential pitfalls. The field of taphonomy, which studies everything that happens to an organism's remains from the moment of death until discovery, plays a crucial role. Bones can be broken by rockfalls within a cave, trampled by animals or other hominins, gnawed by carnivores, or fractured by the sheer pressure of overlying sediments, accumulating over tens of thousands of years. These natural processes can create damage that, to the untrained eye, might resemble intentional trauma. Differentiating a clean-cut mark made by a stone tool from a sharp break caused by a falling rock, or distinguishing a puncture wound from a carnivore tooth mark, requires expert analysis and often microscopic examination. The Shanidar 3 case highlights these challenges. While the rib lesion is widely accepted by many researchers as a projectile injury, alternative explanations have been proposed over the years, though generally not sustained. Could it have been a bizarre accident, perhaps a fall onto a sharp object? The location and angle make this less likely than a thrown weapon. Could it be post-mortem damage that coincidentally mimics a weapon wound? The evidence of partial healing around the lesion definitively rules this out, as healing can only occur in a living individual. This very healing, however, introduces another layer of complexity. It tells us Shanidar 3 survived the initial injury, but it also means the bone tissue began to remodel, potentially obscuring some of the finer details of the wound channel that might have existed had the injury been immediately fatal. Scholars still debate the precise evidentiary threshold required to definitively classify an ancient injury as resulting from interpersonal violence, especially when direct proof like an embedded weapon tip is absent. For example, blunt force trauma to the skull is notoriously difficult to interpret. A depressed fracture could be from a blow, but also from a severe fall. Context is key. A single individual with such an injury might be an accident, but multiple individuals in the same site with similar trauma patterns might suggest conflict. One quirky aspect of this field is the use of actualistic studies, where researchers might, for instance, observe how bones are damaged by modern carnivores, or simulate rockfalls to understand the kinds of breakage patterns these processes create, providing a comparative baseline for interpreting ancient remains. In the case of Shanidar 3, the combination of the wound's morphology, its shape, depth, and clean edges, its location on the body, and the evidence of partial healing creates a compelling argument for an intentional projectile injury. However, the ongoing scrutiny and reevaluation of such finds are vital to the scientific process, ensuring that conclusions are based on the most robust evidence possible rather than on preconceived notions about the savagery or nobility of our ancient ancestors. The story etched in Shanidar 3's rib continues to be read and reread, each examination aiming for a clearer understanding of that distant, violent event. The story of Shanidar 3 didn't end with its initial discovery and analysis in the mid-20th century. Like many significant paleoanthropological finds, his remains have been subject to repeated study as new scientific techniques and analytical perspectives have emerged. Modern forensics, once primarily the domain of crime scene investigators, now plays an increasingly vital role in re-examining ancient human remains, offering fresh insights into cases like this 45,000-year-old potential murder. Advanced imaging technologies such as high-resolution CT scanning and scanning electron microscopy allow for non-destructive, minutely detailed examinations of bone trauma. These methods can reveal microscopic features within a wound, such as cut mark signatures or embedded foreign particles, that would be invisible to the naked eye or through traditional X-rays. For Shanidar 3, CT scans have provided clearer three-dimensional views of the rib lesion, helping to confirm its depth, trajectory, and the extent of the partial healing. These scans allow researchers to virtually dissect the bone and the wound, looking for any subtle clues about the weapon that might have caused it. Experimental archaeology, another key tool, complements these forensic analyses. As mentioned earlier, this involves recreating Paleolithic weapons and testing their effects. For instance, researchers might craft replica stone points, haft them onto spear shafts, and then use them to strike animal carcasses, often pigs whose ribs and flesh offer a reasonable analog to human anatomy. By varying the type of point, the force of impact, and the angle of entry, they can create a reference collection of different wound types. These experimentally produced wounds are then compared to the ancient trauma, like that on Shanidar 3's rib, to see which type of weapon and delivery mechanism provides the closest match. This kind of research led Stephen Churchill and his colleagues in 2009 to strongly support the projectile hypothesis for Shanidar 3, suggesting a relatively low-velocity thrown spear, rather than a high-velocity atlatl dart, was more consistent with the observed trauma, potentially implicating another Neanderthal rather than a Homo sapiens with more advanced weaponry. Scholars still debate the precise interpretation of these experimental results, as exact replication of ancient conditions is impossible, and the variables are numerous. However, such studies provide a much more rigorous, evidence-based approach than simple speculation. One quirky yet scientifically valuable aspect of such research is the detailed cataloging of cut marks made by different stone tool types on bone, creating a ballistics of sorts for ancient edged weapons. Comparative anatomy also plays a role, looking at trauma patterns in other hominin fossils, and even in modern clinical cases to understand how bodies react to and heal from different kinds of injuries. The re-examination of Shanidar 3 using these modern techniques demonstrates how old discoveries can continue to yield new information, keeping the case alive and ensuring that our understanding of this ancient event evolves with scientific progress. It's a testament to the enduring power of forensic science to reach across millennia. The story of Shanidar 3 is more than just an ancient cold case. It's a profound window into the realities of life and death in the deep past. The evidence etched on a single rib bone has fueled decades of scientific inquiry, pushing the boundaries of paleoanthropology and forensic science. We've seen how this individual Neanderthal, living on the cusp of major human evolutionary change, suffered a violent projectile wound, survived for a time, and ultimately became a focal point for understanding Neanderthal capabilities, their social structures, and their potential interactions with early modern humans. The enduring debates surrounding the perpetrator, the weapon, and the motive highlight the challenges and complexities of interpreting ancient evidence. Yet, through meticulous research, from initial excavations to modern CT scans and experimental archaeology, Shanidar 3 continues to teach us about the ancient roots of conflict, resilience, and perhaps even compassion, reminding us that our human story is one of immense depth and shared, complex behaviors.